The boardroom on the 48th floor existed in that peculiar silence that only extreme wealth could purchase, walls thick enough to swallow sound carpet, dense enough to absorb footsteps, air conditioning, precise enough to eliminate even the whisper of moving air. Catherine Sterling stood at the head of the mahogany table that had cost more than most people earned in 5 years, reviewing quarterly projections with the cold efficiency of a surgeon examining tissue samples. At 33, she'd inherited Sterling Financial Group at 28, when her father collapsed in his office, and she'd spent every day since proving she was more than Gregory Sterling's daughter, more than the beautiful face that appeared in Forbes profiles, more than the ice queen her employees whispered about when they thought she couldn't hear. The Valentino suit she wore, charcoal gray, with subtle pinstripes that cost $4,000, fit like architecture, every line calculated to project authority without aggression, power without apology. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that probably had a French name, severe enough to suggest she had no time for vanity, but polished enough to show she understood presentation mattered in rooms where billions changed hands on the strength of confidence. The Louboutins on her feet added 3 inches to her 5'7" frame, red soles hidden, but somehow still announcing their presence the way certain types of power announce themselves, through absence rather than display. 6 analysts sat around the table, Harvard important credentials framed on office walls 30 floors below, annual salaries that would make surgeons jealous, performance bonuses tied to accuracy that should have made them obsessive about details. They nodded along as Marcus Blackwell, board chairman, 56 years old, silver hair that looked distinguished rather than aged, gestured at the projection screen with the confidence of someone who'd been making presentations in rooms like this since before most of them were born. The European exposure model shows 22% projected growth. His voice carried the slight rasp of expensive cigars and single malt scotch, the sound of privilege, worn smooth by decades of unchallenged authority. Conservative estimates, solid fundamentals, minimal downside risk across all scenarios we've stress tested. Catherine studied the numbers with the focus she brought to everything, the same intensity that made her work 16-hour days, the same precision that meant she could recite quarterly earnings from memory, the same ruthless attention that had turned Sterling Financial from her father's mid-sized firm into a Wall Street powerhouse managing $18 billion in assets. Something bothered her about the volatility coefficients, the way certain numbers aligned too perfectly, the kind of perfect that came from forcing data into predetermined conclusions rather than letting conclusions emerge from honest analysis. She opened her mouth to question the methodology when movement caught her peripheral vision. In the corner of the room, barely visible behind the mobile cleaning cart that smelled faintly of industrial lemon and floor wax, a man in a faded blue custodial uniform had paused his work. At 38, Daniel Matthews wore his janitor's clothes the way some people wore uniforms of defeat, not with shame exactly, but with the careful invisibility of someone who'd learned that being noticed meant being vulnerable. His hands, scarred and calloused from 4 years of mopping floors and emptying trash, gripped the handle of his cart with the kind of tension that suggested he was fighting the urge to do something inadvisable. His eyes, and this was what made Catherine pause, what made something in her chest tighten with recognition she didn't yet understand, were scanning the projection screen with an intensity that didn't belong in someone whose job description involved removing coffee cups and wiping down conference tables. Intelligence burned there, sharp and focused and impossibly out of place, the kind of comprehension that came from understanding not just what numbers meant, but why they mattered, from they came from, what they revealed about the people who'd created them. He shook his head. The movement was tiny, barely visible, the kind of involuntary reactions someone might make when witnessing a car accident about to happen, when seeing danger others couldn't perceive. But Catherine caught it because she'd learned to notice everything, because 16-hour days and 5 years of proving herself meant she'd developed radar for dissent, for doubt, for the tiny fractures in consensus that sometimes meant someone saw truth others missed. The room felt suddenly smaller, air pressure changing the way it did before storms. Every person in that conference room earned more in annual salary than Daniel Matthews would see in 5 years of night shifts. And yet something in his expression suggested he knew something they didn't understood, something they'd missed despite their credentials and their confidence and their absolute certainty that they were the smartest people in any room they entered. "You," Catherine's voice cut through the presentation like a scalpel through skin, precise and impossible to ignore. The word hung in the air, sharp-edged, demanding response. Every head turned toward the janitor who'd somehow committed the cardinal sin of being noticed, of mattering, of existing as more than convenient invisibility. Daniel's shoulders tensed, the body language of someone who'd learned that attention was dangerous, that being seen meant being targeted. His face showed the calculation of a man weighing options, acknowledge the CEO's direct address, and face whatever consequences came with speaking or pretend he hadn't heard, and hope invisibility could be reclaimed. You have something to say. Not a question this time. A command that expected obedience, because commands from Catherine Sterling always received obedience, always resulted in compliance, always reminded everyone in her orbit that she didn't ask things twice. Ma'am, the word caught in his throat, years of practiced silence warring with something stronger, something that looked almost like integrity, refusing to stay buried. He glanced at Marcus Blackwell, at the projection screen, at the 6 analysts who were staring at him with expressions ranging from confusion to contempt, the universal disdain that certain types of educated people reserve for those who clean their offices and empty their wastebaskets. Speak, a single syllable, but it carried weight, carried permission, carried something that might have been curiosity, or might have been the ruthless efficiency of someone who'd learned that unexpected sources sometimes provided the most valuable intelligence. You're about to lose $18 million. Daniel's voice came out steady despite the trembling in his hands, despite 4 years of learning to stay silent, despite every survival instinct screaming that speaking truth to power had cost him everything once and would cost him everything again. Your compound interest formula in column J is calculating simple interest rates against compound growth projections. The European markets you're modeling use backward-looking historical volatility when current conditions require forward-looking implied volatility measures. The correlation matrix you've built assumes parallel movement across asset classes that don't actually correlate. Sovereign bonds and corporate derivatives have fundamentally different risk profiles that can't be weighted equivalently without introducing systematic error that compounds over the projection period. Silence fell like a physical weight. Catherine felt her pulse accelerate, felt something like electricity run down her spine, felt the particular thrill that came from recognizing expertise in unexpected places. This janitor, this man in a $15 uniform who smelled like floor polish and industrial soap, had just identified in 30 seconds the exact problem she'd been circling for 3 days, the issue her 6 Ivy League analysts had missed completely, despite their sophisticated models and their expensive educations and their absolute confidence in their own brilliance. Marcus Blackwell's face underwent a remarkable transformation, pale shock bleeding into flushed anger, the particular rage of important men who'd been contradicted by people they considered beneath notice. His voice came out strangled, aristocratic composure fracturing to reveal something uglier underneath. Who the hell do you think you are? Daniel met his eyes without flinching, and Catherine saw something pass between them. Some recognition that suggested history she didn't understand, context she was missing. Someone who knows finance. The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, carried challenge, carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd lost everything and discovered that having nothing left to lose was its own kind of power. I'm sorry for the interruption. I'll finish my work and get out of your way. Wait. Catherine heard herself speak before consciously deciding to herd the command in her voice that made Daniel freeze halfway to his cart, heard the shift in room dynamics as power redistributed itself around this new focal point. What's your name? Daniel Matthews, ma'am. The formality carried distance, carried the practiced deference of someone who'd learned to interact with people who held power over his employment, his survival, his ability to feed his daughter. My office. Catherine checked her watch. Cartier inherited from her father, worth more than Daniel probably earned in 6 months. 30 minutes, don't be late. She watched him push his cart toward the door, watched the way he moved with quiet efficiency that spoke of someone who'd perfected the art of taking up minimal space, of existing without demanding acknowledgement. The analysts were staring at her with expressions suggesting she'd lost her mind, suggesting that bringing custodial staff into confidential financial discussions violated every protocol of hierarchy and propriety that kept their world ordered and comprehensible. Marcus Blackwell stood abruptly, chair-scraping against expensive carpet in a way that made everyone wince. Catherine, this is highly irregular. You can't bring someone without proper clearance, without credentials, without... He was in the room during our confidential discussion. Marcus, she kept her voice level, kept her expression neutral, kept her eyes on the board chairman, who'd been her father's closest friend and who'd guided her through 5 years of learning how to run a company she'd inherited too young. Either our confidential discussions aren't actually confidential or the damage is already done. In either way, he identified an $18 million error that your team missed. So unless you'd prefer we lose that money proving our credentials matter more than accuracy, I'm going to find out why a janitor understands our risk models better than our paid analysts. The meeting dissolved into uncomfortable murmurs, people gathering laptops and files and retreating to offices where they could dissect what had just happened, where they could process the impossible fact that someone they'd walked past 1,000 times without seeing had just upended their careful hierarchies. Catherine remained at the head of the table staring at the projection screen, where Daniel's analysis sat like an accusation, where $18 million of potential loss glowed in numbers that should have been caught, should have been questioned, should have been impossible to miss for people paid specifically to notice exactly these kinds of errors. She pulled out her phone, typed a message to HR with the efficiency of someone who made dozens of decisions before most people finished their first coffee. Send me complete employment. File for Daniel Matthews, custodial services. Night shift, everything application background check, previous employment, references, gaps, everything you have. The response came back within 90 seconds. The kind of speed that came from knowing Catherine Sterling's requests weren't actually requests, were commands that expected immediate compliance regardless of whatever else might be happening. The file arrived as a PDF, 47 pages of standard employment documentation that told a story Catherine had to read twice to believe she was understanding correctly. Daniel Matthews, age 38. Education. Wharton School of Business MBA with focus on quantitative analysis and risk assessment, graduated in top 5% of his class. Previous employment, Quantum Investments. Senior Financial Analyst, 2016-2021. Compensation history, showing steady progression from 80,000 to 160,000 annually performance reviews that used words like exceptional and irreplaceable and destined for partnership track. And nothing. 3 years of employment gap that the application explained away with a single typed line. Personal circumstances required career break. Current position, custodial services, night shift, $32,000 annually. Emergency contact listed as Sophie Matthews' daughter, age 7. No references from Quantum Investments. No explanation for how someone with a Wharton MBA and 5 years at one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms ended up mopping floors for barely minimum wage. No details about the personal circumstances that could transform a rising star into invisible labor, could reduce someone from partnership track to night shift. Janitor could represent the kind of fall that is suggested either spectacular personal failure or something darker. Something Catherine's instincts said she needed to understand. She stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 48th floor conference room, looking out at Manhattan, spreading beneath her like a circuit board of wealth and ambition, all those buildings full of people fighting their own battles, hiding their own secrets, carrying their own invisible wounds. Somewhere down there, Daniel Matthews had a life she couldn't imagine, had survived something that had destroyed his career but hadn't destroyed him, had learned to exist in her building as convenient invisibility while carrying intelligence that belonged in corner offices rather than supply closets. Catherine returned to her own corner office, 68th floor, views of the Hudson River that cost more per square foot than most Americans paid for entire homes' furniture, that had been selected by designers whose names she'd never learned, art on the walls that probably meant something to people who cared about such things, but that she saw mainly as expensive rectangles proving she'd succeeded. The space felt sterile despite its luxury, felt like a display rather than a place where humans actually lived, felt like the architectural embodiment of isolation disguised as achievement. She kept one photograph on her desk, her father shaking hands with the governor at some charity function 5 years ago. Both men smiling with the practiced ease of people who'd spent lifetimes performing for cameras. Her father had been 58 when his heart had given out, 58 and supposedly healthy except for the stress that came with managing billions, and the pressure that came with being responsible for hundreds of employees, and the weight that came with knowing every decision could destroy lives if made incorrectly. The heart attack had been sudden, massive, fatal before the ambulance arrived. Natural causes, the death certificate said. Tragic but not suspicious, the police had concluded. Just another casualty of the Wall Street lifestyle that demanded everything and gave nothing back except money. She'd been 28, completely unprepared to run a company she'd been learning from the outside, completely overwhelmed by the board of directors who'd made it clear they expected her to be a figurehead they could control. 5 years of proving them wrong, 5 years of working harder than anyone else, 5 years of becoming the ice queen, who had no personal life because personal life was weakness, who had no relationships because relationships were vulnerabilities, who had perfected the art of being an untouchable because being touched meant being hurt. Her intercom buzzed. Daniel Matthews was waiting in reception. Catherine told her assistant to send him in, then immediately regretted the decision because her office felt too intimate, too personal, too much like inviting someone into space she'd carefully kept sterile precisely to avoid this kind of vulnerability. But walking back now would look weak, would suggest uncertainty, would undermine the authority she just demonstrated in the boardroom. Daniel entered with the careful movements of someone navigating unfamiliar territory, someone aware he didn't belong here among the leather furniture and abstract art and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned Manhattan into backdrop. He'd showered and changed from his work uniform into worn jeans and a button-down shirt that had been expensive once but had been washed so many times the fabric had gone soft, had faded to the particular blue that came from years of use rather than designer intention. His hair was still damp, combed back in a way that revealed a face that was younger than his age suggested, but weathered in ways that had nothing to do with time. Sit. Catherine gestured to one of the chairs across from her desk, then immediately moved to the small conference table by the windows because sitting behind her desk felt too much like establishing hierarchy she'd already complicated by calling him here. Coffee, please. He moved to the table with the economy of motion that suggested someone conserving energy, someone who'd learned to be efficient because waste was luxury he couldn't afford. I've been up since 6 with my daughter. Sophie, she's 7. Everything I do is for her. The statement landed with weight, with the particular gravity that came from single parents who'd learned that their choices rippled through small lives that depended entirely on them. Catherine poured coffee from the expensive machine that made coffee taste like coffee should taste, rather than the burnt bitterness that came from the break room percolator. Most employees used added cream because she assumed that's what people did, realized she had no idea how Daniel took his coffee, and suddenly felt absurdly uncertain about this entire interaction. Black is fine. He accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, with gratitude that suggested good coffee was rare luxury rather than daily expectation. Thank you. For this, for listening earlier, for not immediately having me fired for speaking up. Why would I fire you? Catherine sat across from him, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, close enough to smell soap and shampoo, and underneath that, something warmer, something human that her sterile office usually lacked. You were right. You identified an error worth $18 million. That's exactly the kind of input I need from my team. I'm not on your team. I clean floors. I empty trash. I exist in your building after hours when actual employees have gone home to their actual lives. She saw him struggle with something, saw pride war with pragmatism, saw someone who'd learned brutal lessons about staying in his lane. I appreciate what you said in the boardroom, but we both know I'm not part of conversations that happen in rooms like that. Used to be my job. The words came out flat factual without self-pity, but also without hope. Long time ago. Different life. Catherine pulled up his file on her tablet, turned it so he could see the screen. Wharton MBA, 5 years at Quantum Investments as senior analyst. Performance reviews that suggested you were being groomed for partnership. Then 3 years of nothing, and now you're working night shift custodial for a third of what you used to earn. She paused, watching his face, watching the way his jaw tightened, and his eyes went distant, watching pain flicker across his expression before careful control reasserted itself. What happened? As Matthews Daniel stared at the coffee in his hands, watched steam rise and dissipate, seemed to be weighing options in some internal calculation that involved risks, Catherine couldn't see. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd told this story before, who'd learned that emotion made people uncomfortable, and facts alone were barely tolerable. I discovered fraud. He looked up, met her eyes with directness that felt almost confrontational. Major fraud, millions in client money being routed through shell companies, profits being skimmed, accounts being manipulated to hide losses. I spent 6 months documenting everything, building an airtight case, following every protocol for whistleblower protection. I believed the system worked. Believed that reporting fraud meant doing the right thing, meant protecting innocent people, meant standing up for integrity. Catherine felt cold spreading through her chest, felt a particular dread that came from recognizing a pattern, from seeing a story that rhymed with stories she'd heard before. What happened? Quantum's executives hired crisis management experts. They fabricated evidence that I was the one stealing, that I was a disgruntled employee trying to extort the company, that my whistleblower complaint was elaborate cover for my own crimes. They leaked to financial press. They contacted every firm on Wall Street. Within 3 months, I couldn't get hired anywhere. Not at competing firms, not at smaller companies, not even in back-office compliance roles that normally desperate for experienced people. His voice remained steady, but his hands tightened around the coffee cup, knuckles going white. I was blacklisted, completely and thoroughly removed from the only industry I'd ever worked in. The SEC investigated. Catherine knew how these stories went, knew the way justice worked when powerful people had resources to fight back, and regular people had nothing but truth. Eventually, they prosecuted Quantum executives. Eventually, the fraud was exposed. Eventually, Daniel Matthews was vindicated. But vindication came too late. Came after lives were destroyed. Came after damage was permanent. 2 years later, after my wife was dead, after we'd lost everything, Daniel's voice went rough, went raw with grief that hadn't healed despite years of trying. We burned through savings in 3 months. Rachel took 2 jobs trying to keep us afloat, trying to maintain health insurance, trying to pay for her medication for a heart condition she'd managed for years. But we couldn't afford it. Insurance lapsed. She couldn't get her prescriptions. One night she collapsed at her second job. By the time the ambulance got her to the hospital, by the time they called me, by the time I got there, he stopped. Catherine watched him struggle with words that wouldn't come. Watched him force air into lungs that didn't want to work. Watched him carry grief that was still sharp enough to cut despite being 3 years old. Sophie was 4, old enough to know mommy was gone, but too young to understand why. Old enough to ask when mommy was coming back, but too young to comprehend that death was permanent. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his hand, the gesture rough, almost angry. I spent the next year just trying to survive, trying to be present for my daughter, while feeling like I'd killed my wife by being honest, by reporting fraud, by believing that truth mattered more than survival. And now you clean floors in the building where men who destroyed your life make decisions worth millions. Catherine heard the words come out and recognized they were cruel, recognized they highlighted exactly how far Daniel had fallen, but sometimes cruelty was just honesty without cushioning. Now I clean floors, and I go home to my daughter, and I'm alive when my wife isn't. Daniel met her eyes with something that looked like defiance, looked like refusal to be pitied. I don't regret reporting the fraud. I regret that the system didn't protect me like they promised. I regret that Rachel died because I was naive. I regret that Sophie will grow up without her mother because I thought integrity mattered more than pragmatism. But I don't regret telling the truth. That's the only thing I have left that's actually mine. The words hung between them, heavy with implications Catherine was still processing. She thought about her father, about the pressure he'd carried, about the way he'd sometimes looked at her with expressions she couldn't read, like he was carrying weight. He couldn't share bearing burdens. He couldn't transfer. She thought about the photograph on her desk, about the man shaking hands with the governor, about the heart attack that had come suddenly and had killed him before anyone could help. My father died 5 years ago. The words came out before Catherine consciously decided to share them, came out because something in Daniel's honesty demanded reciprocal vulnerability. Heart attack. Massive. Fatal within minutes. He was 58, supposedly healthy except for stress. Everyone said it was tragic, but expected Wall Street lifestyle pressure, responsibility. Natural causes. But you don't believe that. Daniel's voice carried certainty, carried recognition of patterns he'd learned to see. You think there was something wrong about his death? I think my father was carrying something heavy his last few months. I think he was stressed beyond normal work pressure. I think the last conversation we had, he tried to tell me something but didn't finish. Catherine heard herself speaking truths she'd never voiced before, heard herself admitting doubts she'd barely admitted to herself. He said if anything happened to him, I should look into quantum investments. He said I shouldn't trust. She stopped. The memory was suddenly vivid, suddenly sharp, suddenly important in ways she hadn't recognized at 28, but understood now at 33, with 5 years of running the company, 5 years of learning how power worked, 5 years of seeing how corruption hid in plain sight. Shouldn't trust who Daniel leaned forward, an intensity crackling off him like static electricity. Catherine, who did your father tell you not to trust Marcus Blackwell? The name came out in whisper, came out like confession, came out like acknowledging possibility she'd spent 5 years refusing to examine. My father's closest friend, the man who helped me learn to run this company after Dad died, the board chairman who's guided every major decision I've made for 5 years. Daniel's face went carefully blank, went into neutral expression that suggested he was controlling reaction. He didn't want visible. Do you know what position Marcus Blackwell held at Quantum Investments? Catherine felt floor tilting beneath her, felt room temperature dropping, felt the particular vertigo that came from recognizing you'd been standing on quicksand while believing it was solid ground. Tell me, he was on their advisory board. From 2019 until the scandal broke in 2021, he signed off on the restructuring plan that created the shell companies I discovered. He authorized the offshore accounts. His signature is on documents that established the fraud infrastructure. Daniel's voice remained steady, but his eyes burned with something that looked like rage, tempered by years of forced patience. I don't know how much he knew. Maybe he was just window dressing, prestigious name, giving legitimacy to criminal operation. Maybe he genuinely didn't understand what he was signing. Or maybe he knew exactly what he was doing. Catherine finished the thought, finished the implication, finished the terrible logic that suggested her father's closest friend had been part of the conspiracy that destroyed Daniel Matthews, that killed Rachel Matthews, that had possibly. She couldn't finish the thought, couldn't voice the possibility that her father's death hadn't been natural, hadn't been tragic. Bad luck hadn't been the inevitable result of stress, but had been something else, something deliberate. Something that looked like heart attack, but was actually murder, disguised as medical emergency. I need to show you something. The words came out decisively, came out with the particular authority of someone who'd made decision and would not be argued with. My father kept files. Personal files separate from company records. I've never looked through them carefully because doing so felt like violating his privacy, like admitting he might have kept secrets from me. But if Marcus was involved in Quantum's fraud, my father discovered that if his death wasn't natural, you're talking about investigating your board chairman. Daniel's voice carried warning, carried the weight of someone who'd learned brutal lessons about consequences. You're talking about accusing one of the most powerful men on Wall Street of fraud and possibly murder. Catherine, people who do that end up destroyed. Blacklisted if they're lucky, dead if they're not. Your father tried. Look what happened to him. Which is exactly why I need to know the truth. Catherine stood paced to the window, stared out at Manhattan glittering in afternoon sun that made everything look clean and bright and beautiful despite all the rot underneath. My father tried to warn me. He died before he could finish. I've spent 5 years taking guidance from a man who might have killed him. If I don't investigate now, if I don't at least look at what Dad left behind, then I'm complicit in my own blindness. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and Catherine turned to see him watching her with expression she couldn't read, with something that looked like respect or recognition, or perhaps just weary understanding of what she was choosing, what she was risking, what she was about to sacrifice for truth that might destroy her the way it had destroyed him. I'll help you. His voice was quiet, but carried absolute conviction. I'll help you investigate, help you understand financial fraud, help you see what your father saw. But Catherine, you need to understand what you're choosing. Marcus Blackwell has resources I didn't have when I blew the whistle. He has decades of connections. He has money to hire the best lawyers, the best crisis managers, the best people who specialize in destroying anyone who threatens him. If we do this, if we investigate and find something, he'll come after both of us. He'll try to discredit you, remove you from your company, destroy your reputation. And he'll try to finish what he started with, me eliminate the threat I represent. Then why help me? Catherine heard the question come out almost like challenge. You could walk away, take your daughter somewhere safe. Let me handle this alone. Why risk everything again? Daniel stood moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel heat radiating from his body, close enough that the space between them felt charged with something she didn't want to name yet. Because my wife died fighting this same fight. Because Rachel investigated quantum fraud, even knowing the danger, even understanding the risk, because she believed truth mattered more than safety. I won't dishonor her memory by being less brave than she was. He turned to face Catherine directly, and she saw determination in his eyes that looked almost like fury, like controlled rage that had been banked for years waiting for opportunity to burn. And because maybe this time someone with power will actually fight instead of just surviving. Maybe this time the system will work because someone inside the system refuses to let it fail. Maybe this time we finish what my wife and your father started. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, felt alignment happening between them. That was more than professional. Alliance felt recognition of kindred spirit or fellow survivor. Or perhaps just two people who'd been broken by same forces and were deciding to break back. She extended her hand formally, and Daniel took it, and the handshake felt like pact, like promise, like declaration of war against forces neither of them fully understood yet, but both of them had reason to fear. We investigate. Catherine's voice carried authority that came from 5 years of command, but underneath that, something raw, something that sounded almost like hope. We find out what my father knew. We discover Marcus Blackwell's role in quantum fraud. We build case so strong they can't ignore it, can't dismiss it, can't bury it the way they buried your original whistleblower complaint. And we protect Sophie. Daniel's voice was steel-wrapped in velvet, was absolute non-negotiable condition that Catherine understood immediately was his only priority, that mattered more than justice, more than truth, more than revenge. Whatever we discover, whatever we expose, my daughter stays safe. That's the deal. That's the only deal I'll accept. Agreed. Catherine released his hand, but continued holding his gaze, continued the unspoken communication that was happening beneath their words, continued the connection that felt dangerous because it felt real in ways her carefully controlled life usually didn't permit. We keep Sophie safe. We investigate carefully. We don't make moves until we understand exactly what we're dealing with. She returned to her desk, pulled out her business card, wrote her personal cell number on the back in neat handwriting that had been trained by expensive private schools and finished schools and all the institutions that taught wealthy girls how to present themselves as both accessible and untouchable. This is my direct line, not my assistant, not my office, me. You call any time, day or night, if anything seems wrong, if anyone approaches you, if Sophie seems threatened in any way. Daniel took the card, studied it like it might contain hidden messages, then tucked it carefully into his wallet. I work night shift here 4 nights a week. The other 3 nights, I work at a different building in Midtown Insurance Company, less interesting than finance, but pays same terrible wage. I see Sophie off to school at 8, sleep from 9 to 3, pick her up at 3:30, spend evenings with her, then come here at 11. It's not much of a life, but it's what keeps us fed and housed and safe. Change your schedule. Catherine spoke decisively, spoke with the authority of someone who gave orders and expected them to be followed. I'm hiring you as consultant. $500 an hour, minimum 20 hours per week. You'll work during my evening hours after Sophie's asleep. I assume you have someone who can watch her, Mrs. Chen. Our neighbor, she's retired, loves Sophie, watches her sometimes when I need to pick up extra shifts. The words came out slowly, came out like Daniel was trying to process what Catherine was offering, trying to understand if this was genuine opportunity or set up for some trap he couldn't see yet. $500 an hour that's more than I make in 2 weeks of custodial work. That's what financial consultants earn when they're Wharton-educated analysts who can identify $18 million errors in 30 seconds. Catherine pulled out her phone, sent message to HR with her characteristic efficiency. Daniel Matthews promoted to special financial consultant, reporting directly to CEO, effective immediately, salary commensurate with senior analyst level, full benefits, including family medical coverage. The response came back within seconds, the kind of speed that happened when Catherine Sterling made requests that were really commands. Daniel's phone buzzed. Notification of employment status, change notification of benefits, enrollment notification that his annual compensation had just increased from 32,000 to 200,000 plus bonuses. Catherine. His voice broke on her name, broke with something that sounded like disbelief or gratitude, or perhaps just overwhelming relief that surviving was about to become slightly less brutal. I can't. This is you can, and it is. She stood, moved around her desk to where he sat staring at his phone like it might suddenly announce this was mistake or joke or cruel prank. You're qualified. You're needed. You deserve compensation that reflects your value. And practically speaking, I need you focused and effective, which is impossible if you're exhausted from working two jobs and terrified about how to pay for Sophie's medical care. She has asthma. The words tumbled out like confession, like admitting vulnerability he'd kept hidden, inherited it from Rachel. Mostly controlled, but sometimes bad enough to need emergency inhaler, sometimes scary enough that I've taken her to ER at 2 a.m. unable to breathe properly. I haven't been able to afford doctor visits that aren't emergencies. Haven't been able to pay for preventive medication that might keep emergencies from happening. Company insurance for custodial staff covers almost nothing. Now you have executive-level insurance that covers everything. Catherine heard the words come out and recognized she was crossing boundaries, was involving herself in Daniel's life in ways that went beyond professional necessity, was making decisions based partly on strategic calculation, but mostly on something else, something that felt uncomfortably like caring about persons she barely knew but somehow recognized anyway. Take Sophie to pediatric pulmonologist, get her on proper medication, make sure she has every treatment she needs. That's not optional. That's part of keeping her safe, which we agreed was non-negotiable. Daniel stood abruptly, and for a moment, Catherine thought he might hug her, might breach the professional distance they were barely maintaining. Instead, he extended his hand again, and they shook formally, and the gesture felt absurdly inadequate for what had just transpired between them, for the ways their lives had just become entangled, for the alliance they'd formed that was based partly on shared investigation, but also on something deeper, something that suggested two damaged people recognizing each other's wounds and deciding to heal together. I should get home to Sophie. Daniel's voice was rough, was barely controlled. She'll be worried if I'm late. She worries a lot since Rachel died. Worries that I won't come back, that I'll disappear like Mommy disappeared, that she'll be alone. Go. Catherine walked him to her office door, hyper-aware of the space between them, hyper-aware that something had shifted in that space, had become charged with possibility she wasn't ready to examine yet. We'll start work tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. By then I'll have gone through my father's files. I'll have compiled everything I can find about Marcus Blackwell's role at Quantum, and we'll have a plan for investigation that keeps both of us and Sophie safe. After Daniel left, Catherine stood at her window, watching Manhattan transform from afternoon to evening, watching lights begin to glow in 10,000 windows, watching the city perform its daily metamorphosis from business to private lives, from public faces to hidden truths. Somewhere down there, Daniel Matthews was returning to Queens, was collecting his 7-year-old daughter, was beginning to process that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't fully comprehend, yet was learning that surviving wasn't the only option anymore, that maybe something better than mere survival was actually possible. Catherine returned to her desk, opened her laptop, began the process of accessing her father's private files, the ones he'd kept on encrypted drives and in locked cabinets and in safe deposit boxes she'd never examined. Because examining them felt like violating his privacy, like admitting he might have kept secrets from her, like acknowledging that the man who'd been her hero might have been carrying burdens she'd been too young or too naive to recognize. The first file she opened was labeled simply for Catherine, if something happens. The timestamp showed it had been created 3 days before her father's death. Catherine's hands trembled as she clicked it open, as she saw her father's face appear on screen, as she heard his voice rough with stress, worn with fatigue, carrying weight she'd never heard when he was alive because he'd hidden it from her, had protected her from knowing how much danger he'd been carrying. Catherine, if you're watching this, I'm dead. The words were blunt, were direct, were delivered with the efficiency of man who understood time was limited, and it wasn't natural causes. Marcus Blackwell and his associates have been running criminal enterprise through quantum investments in 3 other firms. I have proof. I tried to go to the SEC, but they have people there too. I tried to protect the whistleblower, Daniel Matthews Goodman, who reported the fraud, but they destroyed him before I could get evidence to right people. On screen, her father rubbed his face, looked older than 58, looked exhausted in ways that suggested he'd been carrying this weight for months or perhaps years. I'm going to try one more time to expose them. If it works, you'll never see this. If I die, and I suspect I will, Catherine, I suspect they'll kill me because I'm too dangerous to let live, then you need to understand something. Marcus Blackwell is not your friend. He was not my friend. He's a criminal who's been using legitimate businesses as cover for fraud, for money laundering, for crimes that have destroyed families and stolen billions. The video continued, her father's voice steady, despite the fear Catherine could see in his eyes, despite the knowledge he was recording message for daughter, who would only see it if he was already dead. Do not trust anyone on the current board except Margaret Chen. She's been helping me investigate. She has copies of everything she knows where I've hidden additional evidence. Find her. She'll tell you what I couldn't. And Catherine, I'm so sorry. I should have been brave enough to stop this years ago. I should have stood with Daniel Matthews when he first reported the fraud. My cowardice cost him everything. Don't let my death be meaningless. Finish what I couldn't. The video ended. Catherine sat in darkness, broken only by computer screen's glow, sat with tears running down her face, sat with rage and grief and determination, forming volatile mixture in her chest that felt explosive, felt dangerous, felt like the particular fury that came from discovering someone you loved had been murdered. And the murderer had spent 5 years pretending to be your friend, pretending to guide you, pretending to care about you, while all along planning to use you the same way he'd used your father. Her phone buzzed. Text from Daniel made it home. Sophie is asking why Daddy is crying. I don't know how to explain to 7-year-old that sometimes life gets better in ways that feel impossible after so long expecting it to only get worse. Thank you for listening, for believing me, for giving me chance to be more than janitor again. Catherine typed response through her own tears, through rage that was sharpening into focus, through determination that was solidifying into plan. My father knew what happened to you. He tried to stop it. He was killed before he could. We're going to finish what he started. We're going to expose Marcus Blackwell. We're going to make sure every person he's hurt gets justice. And Daniel, you were never just a janitor. You were survivor. You were someone who refused to stay broken. That's why I believe you. That's why we're going to win. She hit send, then immediately called the one person her father had said she could trust. Margaret Chen answered on second ring, voice wary in the way of people who'd learned that late phone calls usually brought bad news. Margaret, this is Catherine Sterling. I need to meet with you immediately. It's about my father. It's about quantum investments. And it's about the man who killed him. Silence on the line, heavy with implications, heavy with recognition that something dormant was awakening, that secrets carefully buried were being exhumed, that the careful fiction Marcus Blackwell had constructed over 5 years was beginning to fracture. Come to my house in Brooklyn, tonight if possible. Margaret's voice carried urgency, carried fear, carried something that sounded almost like relief. I've been waiting for this call for 5 years. I've been keeping Williams' evidence safe, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. Bring Daniel Matthews if you can. He deserves to know the truth about what really happened to his wife. The words hit Catherine like physical blow, hit her with implications she hadn't considered, hit her with understanding that Rachel Matthews' death hadn't been tragic. Bad luck hadn't been an inevitable result of untreated medical condition, hadn't been one more casualty of the American healthcare system, but had been something else, something deliberate, something that Marcus Blackwell had ordered to silence woman who'd been investigating the same fraud her husband had tried to expose. I'll bring him. Catherine heard her voice come out steady, despite horror crawling up her spine, despite understanding that she was about to enter territory where murder was business strategy, where human lives were acceptable losses, where truth was danger that had to be eliminated by any means necessary. We'll be there in 2 hours. She called. Daniel heard him answer with Sophie's voice in background, asking if that was Miss Catherine from Daddy's work, her domestic warmth in the sound that made Catherine's sterile apartment feel even more empty, even more like expensive prison than private sanctuary. I need you to come with me to Brooklyn tonight. Can Mrs. Chen watch Sophie? It's important. It's about your wife. It's about how she really died. Silence then. Daniel's voice gone hard, gone cold, gone into the particular control that came from someone managing rage by transforming it into ice. I'll be there. Give me address. I'll meet you there. Catherine gave him Margaret Chen's address in Crown Heights, gave him instructions for getting there, gave him warning that what they were about to learn would change everything, would transform their understanding of what they were fighting and why it mattered and what it had already cost before they had even begun. She locked her office road elevator down 68 floors, walked out into Manhattan evening that smelled like exhaust and ambition and 10,000 private struggles, walked toward parking garage where her car waited, walked toward confrontation with truth she'd spent 5 years avoiding because looking at it directly meant acknowledging that her father had been murdered, that she'd been manipulated by his killer, that every decision she'd made for 5 years had been influenced by a man who'd wanted her dead father's company as tool for continuing his criminal enterprise. The drive to Brooklyn took 45 minutes through traffic that moved like molasses, through streets that transitioned from corporate towers to residential neighborhoods, through economic strata that revealed themselves in buildings and businesses and the kinds of people walking sidewalks. Catherine had spent her entire adult life in Manhattan in neighborhoods where money was assumed and displayed and used as marker of belonging. Brooklyn felt different, felt more real, somehow. Felt like place where actual humans lived, actual lives, instead of performing wealth for each other's benefit. Margaret Chen's brownstone sat on tree-lined street in Crown Heights, narrow 3-story building that had probably belonged to her family for generations, that carried history in its brick and brownstone facade in ways that Catherine's expensive apartments never could. Lights glowed warm in windows, suggesting home rather than investment property, suggesting place where life was lived rather than displayed. Daniel was waiting on the stoop when Catherine arrived, and seeing him in context outside her building, outside their professional dynamic, outside the hierarchies that had defined their interaction, felt strange and intimate and somehow right. He'd changed clothes again, wore jeans and sweater that had been nice once, carried himself with tension that suggested he was bracing for impact, bracing for revelation he suspected would hurt, but needed to hear anyway. Are you ready for this? Catherine stopped beside him on the stoop, close enough to feel warmth radiating from his body in the cooling evening air, close enough to see exhaustion in his face that suggested he hadn't slept since their conversation in her office, close enough to recognize that they were both about to step into territory neither could navigate alone. No, Daniel's voice was flat, was honest, was admission of vulnerability that Catherine respected. But we're doing it anyway because not knowing is worse than knowing, even when knowing hurts. Margaret opened the door before they could knock, ushered them inside with urgency that suggested she'd been watching for their arrival, that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment longer than they'd been planning it. She was 68 but looked younger, looked vital in ways that suggested she'd stayed sharp through necessity, through maintaining vigilance against threats others couldn't see. Come to the kitchen. We'll talk there. Too many windows in the living room, too much visibility from street. If Marcus Blackwell learns you're here, if he knows what I'm about to tell you, he'll move against us immediately. So we need to be fast, need to be thorough, need to make sure you understand everything before you leave here tonight. The kitchen was small, dated warm in ways that Catherine's expensive spaces never achieved. Walls covered with photographs, families spanning generations, children growing into adults, moments of joy and celebration in ordinary life that continued despite whatever darkness existed outside these walls. Tea kettle whistled on ancient gas stove steam, rising like ghosts of everyone who'd lived here before, everyone who'd gathered in this space and told their stories and continued living despite pain and loss and everything that tried to break them. Margaret poured tea into mismatched cups, set out cookies that looked homemade, performed rituals of hospitality that felt almost absurd given what they were about to discuss, but also felt necessary, felt like maintaining humanity in face of inhuman actions, felt like insisting that kindness mattered even when cruelty seemed more practical. Your father came to me 18 months before he died. Margaret spoke directly to Catherine, spoke with precision of someone who'd thought carefully about what needed to be said and how to say it efficiently. He'd discovered irregularities in Sterling Financial's relationship with Quantum Investments, wanted me to help him investigate, Because I'd worked at Quantum for 30 years before retiring, because I knew how the company actually operated versus how it presented itself publicly. What did you find? Daniel leaned forward, hands wrapped around teacup like he needed the warmth, like he needed something to anchor him as ground shifted beneath his understanding. Everything you'd reported and more. Margaret pulled box from cabinet, set it on table between them. Inside documents, flash drives, notebooks filled with handwriting Catherine recognized as her father's. The fraud wasn't limited to Quantum. Marcus Blackwell had been running version of the same scheme through 4 different firms over 15 years. Shell companies in Cayman Islands and Delaware. Offshore accounts in Switzerland and Singapore. Money laundering disguised as legitimate investment activity. He'd stolen over $2 billion, and when people got close to discovering it, when whistleblowers reported it, when investigators started asking questions, he killed them. Daniel's voice was dead, was certain, was spoken with absolute understanding of what Margaret was about to confirm. Not personally, Margaret's correction was precise, was important. He hired people. Professional people who made deaths look natural. Heart attacks, accidents, suicides. Over 12 years, 17 people died while investigating or threatening to expose Quantum fraud. All sudden, all attributed to natural causes or tragic circumstances. All perfectly timed to eliminate threats before they could testify, before they could go public, before they could provide evidence that couldn't be suppressed. Catherine felt room tilting, felt her understanding of reality fragmenting, felt the particular horror that came from recognizing patterns so evil it was almost incomprehensible. 17 murders, not crimes of passion, not heat-of-moment violence, but calculated elimination of human obstacles to continued profitability. Murder as business strategy, death as acceptable cost of protecting fraud. Rachel Matthews was one of them. Margaret's voice was gentle, but words were devastating, were confirmation of what Daniel had already begun to suspect, but hoped wasn't true. She came to me 3 weeks before she died. Your wife was brilliant, Daniel. She'd traced money through 6 layers of shell companies to personal accounts belonging to Marcus Blackwell. She had proof that wasn't just fraud, but tax evasion, money laundering crimes that carried decades of prison time. She wanted to give evidence to. You wanted you to have ammunition to restart investigation, wanted justice for what they'd done to your career. Why didn't she? Daniel's voice broke on the question, broke with grief, renewed, broke with understanding that his wife had been murdered, not because of anything he'd done, but because of what she'd discovered independently, because she'd been brave enough to fight when he'd been too broken to continue, because they killed her first. Margaret pulled out photograph hospital record laboratory results. I was working as RN at Mount Sinai when she was brought in. I noticed something irregular attending physician-ordered potassium level test, but results never made it into her chart. I kept copy. Her potassium was critically elevated, higher than human body produces naturally. Someone had injected her with potassium chloride, caused cardiac arrest that looked completely natural unless you knew to test for it within hours of death. The document Margaret pushed across tables showed numbers Catherine didn't understand, but Daniel clearly did. His face went white, went empty, went into shock that looked almost like shutdown. They murdered her. Not neglect, not medical emergency. We couldn't afford to treat properly. They murdered my wife because she was investigating them. William tried to stop it. Margaret's voice carried regret, carried guilt of survivor who'd watched others die while remaining safe through cowardice. He'd figured out the pattern, understood that people were being killed, tried to warn Rachel, but reached her too late. After she died, he became desperate. Knew he was next. Recorded messages, hid evidence, prepared for his own death, while trying to create insurance policy that would ensure his murder wouldn't be perfect crime. And then they killed him too. Catherine's voice was steady, but inside she was screaming. Inside she was fragmenting. Inside she was transforming from person who'd believed world was ordered and comprehensible into person who understood that beneath surface of civilization was something savage, something that killed without hesitation when killing served profit. How? Same way, Margaret pulled out another set of documents, these showing William Sterling's hospital admission, his laboratory results, his death certificate. Heart attack, massive and fatal. Except his potassium levels were also elevated, also showed evidence of injection rather than natural cardiac event. I tried to get autopsy ordered, But Marcus Blackwell intervened as next of kin advisor claimed, William wouldn't have wanted invasive examination, convinced authorities that cardiac death was expected for stressed executive. She looked at Catherine with eyes that carried years of knowledge, years of silence, years of watching evil flourish, because good people were too afraid or too overwhelmed to fight back. I've kept all this evidence for 5 years, kept it hidden, kept it safe, kept waiting for someone brave enough to use it. Your father thought he could be that person. He was wrong. But maybe you can be. Maybe together, the three of us, we can finish what William and Rachel started. Daniel stood abruptly, moved to sink, stood with back to them, while his shoulders shook with grief. He'd been containing with rage. He'd been suppressing with pain that was fresh, despite being years old, because understanding that Rachel had been murdered rather than dying from preventable medical crisis changed everything. Changed his guilt, changed his understanding of what he'd lost and why it had been taken from him. Catherine moved to stand beside him, not touching but present, not speaking but offering solidarity, not fixing but witnessing, because sometimes witnessing was all anyone could offer, and sometimes that was enough. They stood together in Margaret Chen's kitchen while truth settled around them like fallout, while their understanding of the world reformed into something darker and more dangerous and somehow more clear. We need to go to authorities. Catherine heard herself speak with CEO voice, with command voice, with assumption that systems worked and justice was achievable through proper channels. We have evidence of 17 murders. We have financial documentation of fraud. We have nothing that will survive Marcus Blackwell's legal team. Daniel's voice was rough, was experienced, was spoken by someone who'd already tried to fight through official channels and learned brutal lessons about how power protected itself. Everything we have can be challenged, can be questioned, can be dismissed as circumstantial or misinterpreted or fabricated by people with grudges. Margaret keeping documents doesn't prove they're authentic. My wife's potassium levels don't prove murder without witness to injection. Your father's recordings don't prove he was killed, they just prove he was paranoid about being killed, which his lawyers will argue was result of stress-induced mental decline. Then what do? Catherine heard frustration in her own voice, heard the particular rage of someone who'd discovered evil but couldn't immediately fix it, couldn't immediately achieve justice, couldn't immediately make world right through sheer force of will. We build case that's unassailable. Daniel turned to face them both, face still wet with tears, but eyes clear, burning with determination that looked almost like fever. We document everything. We find additional witnesses. We trace money so thoroughly they can't claim accounting errors. We build timeline of deaths that shows pattern too consistent to be coincidence. We work with authorities who aren't compromised if any exist. And we do it carefully, quietly, without Marcus knowing we're investigating until case is so complete he can't escape. How long will that take? Margaret's question was practical. Was recognition that time mattered, that every day that passed meant Marcus Blackwell continued profiting from fraud and possibly continued eliminating anyone who threatened him. Months, maybe a year. Daniel's answer was honest, was realistic, was acknowledgement that justice moves slowly while injustice operated at speed. But we don't have choice. Rushing means we make mistakes, means he gets warning, means we end up dead like Rachel and William and 17 others who thought they could expose him without being thorough enough, without being careful enough, without understanding that fighting powerful psychopath required being smarter and more patient than the psychopath himself. Catherine absorbed this, absorbed the timeline, absorbed the reality that she was committing to months or years of investigation while pretending nothing was wrong, while continuing to take guidance from man she now knew was murderer, while maintaining facade that kept her and Daniel and Margaret alive long enough to build case that could finally permanently destroy Marcus Blackwell. I'm in. Her voice was steady, was certain, was commitment she would not take back regardless of cost. We do this properly. We build case that survives legal challenge. We protect each other and especially protect Sophie because she's innocent in all of this and deserves to grow up without losing another parent to Marcus Blackwell's evil. She looked at Daniel, at man who'd survived being destroyed and was choosing to fight again, despite knowing the costs, looked at Margaret, at woman who'd been silent for years waiting for someone brave enough to act, looked at both of them and felt something like hope mixed with dread, felt certainty that they were about to enter war. They might not survive but had to fight anyway, because not fighting meant being complicit, meant letting evil continue, meant dishonoring memory of everyone who died trying to stop exactly what they were about to attempt. We start tomorrow. Planning documentation, building timeline, identifying allies. Margaret, you'll coordinate research. Daniel, you'll analyze financial trails. I'll handle authorities carefully identifying who we can trust and who might be compromised. And all of us will watch for any indication that Marcus suspects any sign that we're in danger, any hint that we need to move faster or pull back or protect ourselves. They sat in Margaret's kitchen until past midnight, drinking tea that went cold, eating cookies that tasted like normal life, building plan that would consume next year of their lives and possibly end those lives if they made mistakes, if they were discovered, if Marcus Blackwell realized what they were attempting before they were ready to reveal it. When Catherine finally left, driving through Brooklyn streets empty except for occasional delivery truck or taxi when she crossed bridge back into Manhattan and watched city lights reflect off water in patterns that looked almost beautiful. If you didn't think about what happened in those buildings, in those offices, in those spaces where decisions were made that destroyed lives, she felt something shift in her understanding of who she was and what she was capable of becoming. She'd been Ice Queen for 5 years, had been untouchable and isolated, and safe in loneliness that protected her from being hurt. But protection from being hurt also meant protection from being alive, meant existing in stasis rather than engaging with messy reality of human connection and human struggle and human choice to fight for justice, even when justice seemed impossible. Daniel Matthews had walked into her boardroom and shattered her careful illusions with 3 sentences about compound interest and volatility coefficients. But what he'd really done was remind her that beneath her expensive suits and corner offices and cultivated isolation was a person who'd once believed things mattered, who'd once thought she could make difference, who'd once been capable of caring about more than quarterly earnings and stock prices, and all the metrics that measured success and without measuring meaning. Her father had died trying to do right thing. Rachel Matthews had died trying to do right thing. 17 people had died trying to do right thing. And Catherine Sterling, who'd spent 5 years protecting herself from feeling anything too intensely, who'd perfected art of being powerful without being vulnerable, who'd mastered skill of commanding without connecting, Catherine Sterling was about to risk everything trying to finish what they'd started. She arrived at her apartment building, an Upper East Side building with doorman who knew better than to ask questions, building with elevator that moved in whisper quiet efficiency, building where everyone was wealthy enough to ignore each other and wealthy enough to believe that wealth protected them from consequences that destroyed other people. Her apartment was exactly as she'd left it, sterile, expensive, empty in ways that had nothing to do with physical absence of other humans. Catherine poured herself the scotch. She rarely drank, stood at floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking city that never slept, city that was beautiful and terrible, and full of people fighting battles she'd never see, carrying burdens she'd never know about, surviving in ways that required more courage than her insulated life had ever demanded. Her phone buzzed. Text from Daniel, made it home. Sophie asking why I've been gone so long. Trying to figure out how to explain to 7-year-old that sometimes adults discover terrible truths that change everything, but also somehow make everything make sense for first time. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for giving me chance to fight back. Rachel would be proud that someone's finally finishing what she started. Catherine typed response, typed truth she'd never admitted before. My father would be proud that someone's finishing what he started. And Daniel, I'm not doing this just for justice. I'm doing it because I'm tired of being afraid, tired of being alone, tired of pretending I'm strong because I don't need anyone when really I've just been too scared to let anyone close enough to hurt me. We're going to win this together, and when we do, we're going to prove that truth matters more than power, that integrity survives when everything else fails, that broken people can be dangerous when they decide to stop accepting being broken. She sent the message, then sat in darkness, broken only by city lights, then cried for first time in 5 years, then felt something like strength emerging from exhaustion, felt determination crystallizing from grief, felt the particular clarity that came from finally understanding what mattered and what was worth fighting for and what she was willing to sacrifice to achieve it. Outside, Manhattan continued its endless dance of wealth and ambition. Inside, Catherine Sterling was transforming from CEO who ruled through fear into warrior who would fight through courage. The Ice Queen was melting. What emerged underneath was more dangerous than Marcus Blackwell had ever imagined. And somewhere in Queens, Daniel Matthews was holding his daughter, was promising her that daddy was fighting to make world safer, was believing for first time in 4 years that maybe surviving wasn't the only option, that maybe justice was actually achievable, that maybe his wife's death would mean something more than tragedy if he could finish what she died trying to accomplish. Tomorrow they would begin. Tomorrow the real work would start. Tomorrow they would take first steps toward exposing evil that had flourished in darkness for over a decade. But tonight, for this moment, they were simply survivors who'd found each other, who'd recognized shared wounds, who'd decided that healing meant fighting rather than hiding, meant standing rather than cowering, meant choosing courage over safety and truth over comfortable lies. The war against Marcus Blackwell had begun. The casualties were already counted. The stakes were life and death, and everything that made life worth living, despite death's inevitability. And for first time since their respective falls, both Catherine Sterling and Daniel Matthews felt something that had been absent for too long. Hope that wasn't naive, wasn't based on illusion, but was grounded in recognition that sometimes justice required people willing to risk everything. Sometimes truth required warriors rather than witnesses. Sometimes changing world meant accepting that world might destroy you in process, but fighting anyway because alternative was accepting evil's permanence. They'd made their choice. Tomorrow would reveal whether it was choice that led to victory or choice that led to graves beside William Sterling and Rachel Matthews and 17 others who'd been brave enough to fight and unlucky enough to lose. But that was tomorrow's question. Tonight they were alive, they were allied, they were armed with truth and determination and each other. And sometimes that was enough to begin. Daniel arrived at Catherine's office at 7 p.m. carrying a backpack that looked like it had survived war, frayed straps, faded canvas patches covering tears that suggested years of hard use. He'd left Sophie with Mrs. Chen after dinner, had kissed his daughter goodnight, while lying about where he was going, had promised he'd be home before she woke up, even though that promise felt increasingly fragile given what they were about to attempt. Catherine had spent the day in meetings pretending everything was normal, pretending Marcus Blackwell was trusted advisor rather than suspected murderer, pretending her smile meant cooperation rather than surveillance. The performance exhausted her more than 16-hour workdays ever had exhausted her because maintaining facade required constant vigilance, required monitoring every word and gesture and expression to ensure nothing revealed her true purpose. Come in. She gestured Daniel toward the conference table where she'd spread documents, her father's files. Margaret's evidence timeline of 17 deaths that Margaret had compiled over 5 years of silent witnessing. The overhead lights were harsh institutional, turned late evening into timeless space where only work existed, where personal lives receded and investigation consumed everything. Daniel moved to the table, scanned documents with practiced efficiency that came from years of financial analysis, years of pattern recognition, years of training that had never left him, despite custodial work that demanded nothing more complex than remembering which cleaning solution worked on which surfaces. His finger traced connections Catherine had mapped, followed money through shell companies, tracked deaths through timeline that showed pattern too consistent for coincidence. This is meticulous. His voice carried approval, carried recognition that Catherine understood thoroughness mattered more than speed. But we're missing something. These 17 deaths, they're all people who investigated or threatened to expose the fraud. But what about the original victims, the clients whose money was stolen? There should be hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Where are they? Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach, felt recognition of question she should have asked, but hadn't felt the particular dread that came from realizing investigation had blind spot that might be critical. You're right, Margaret's documentation focuses on whistleblowers and investigators. But the actual fraud victims, the people whose retirement accounts were looted, whose investments were diverted, whose trust was betrayed, they're not here, because Marcus made sure they couldn't complain. Daniel pulled laptop from his battered backpack, opened files that glowed against his face in darkened office. I spent last night searching. Cross-referenced quantum investments, client lists against obituaries, against missing persons reports, against any public record of people who might have discovered their money was gone and tried to get it back. What did you find? Catherine moved closer, close enough to see his screen, close enough to smell soap and coffee, and underneath that, something warmer, something human that her office usually lacked. 37 additional deaths over 12 years, all quantum clients, all wealthy enough that losing millions would be noticed, all dying within 6 months of requesting account audits or questioning investment returns or threatening legal action. The pattern repeats: heart attacks, accidents, suicides, every death attributed to natural causes or tragic circumstances. No autopsies, no investigations. Just wealthy people dying and their heirs inheriting accounts that had been systematically looted. Inheriting problems that families usually settled quietly rather than pursuing through public litigation. Catherine stared at numbers, at names, at lives that had ended, not because they'd done anything wrong, but because they'd noticed something wrong being done to them. 54 total murders, not 17. 54 human beings eliminated because they threatened Marcus Blackwell's criminal enterprise, because they'd discovered theft or fraud or pattern that needed explaining. We need to contact the families. Her voice was steady despite horror crawling through her chest. We need to show them what really happened. We need their testimony, their support, their willingness to stand as witnesses when we finally expose this. Carefully. Daniel's word carried warning, carried experience of someone who tried to fight too openly and paid brutal price. If we contact too many people, if word spreads, Marcus will know we're investigating before we're ready. We approach maybe 5 families maximum, people who have reasons to already suspect something wrong, people who might be willing to cooperate without immediately going public, people who understand that patience serves justice better than premature action. How do we choose? Catherine heard frustration in her own voice, heard the impossible weight of deciding which victims' families deserved approach and which would remain ignorant of truth, at least temporarily. We choose the ones who are already asking questions. Daniel typed rapidly, pulled up news articles, blog posts, social media searches. Look, 3 families have been publicly questioning their relatives' deaths. Not accusations of murder necessarily, but expressed doubts about official narratives, inconsistencies. They noticed details that didn't align with what they knew about their loved ones. He highlighted articles: daughter in Chicago, who'd questioned why her father, marathon runner, health obsessive, had suddenly died of heart attack at 52. Son in Boston, who'd noted his mother had been preparing to file lawsuit against Quantum Investments days before fatal car accident. Widow in Seattle, who'd written blog post about husband's supposed suicide despite him showing no signs of depression and having scheduled meeting with financial crimes attorney the week after his death. These 3, Daniel's voice was certain. They're already suspicious. They're already looking for answers. We approach them carefully, show them evidence, build coalition of families who want justice and understand that justice requires patience and coordination rather than individual action that Marcus can isolate and suppress. Catherine nodded, absorbed strategy, recognized Daniel's intelligence wasn't just technical analysis, but tactical thinking, psychological understanding of how to build case that survived, challenge, how to create momentum that couldn't be stopped and once initiated. I'll handle initial contact. CEO reaching out about irregularities in father's business practices feels more legitimate than janitor turned consultant making accusations about murder conspiracy. Former janitor. Daniel's correction carried something between pride and defiance. You promoted me. Remember, I'm special financial consultant now, which means Marcus Blackwell knows my name, knows my position, knows I'm working directly with you. We need to be prepared for him to investigate my background, discover I'm the quantum whistleblower he destroyed 4 years ago. Recognize I represent existential threat to everything he's built. The words hung between them, heavy with implication, heavy with recognition that their alliance had already made them targets even before they had accomplished anything concrete. Catherine felt fear, sharp and immediate, felt protective instinct that was professional concern mixed with something more personal, something she wasn't ready to name yet. We protect Sophie first. Her voice came out fierce, came out with conviction that surprised her with its intensity. Whatever happens, whatever Marcus discovers, your daughter stays safe. That's non-negotiable. That's the only rule that matters more than investigation. Agreed. Daniel met her eyes with gratitude that looked almost painful, with relief that suggested he'd been terrified of exactly this conversation. terrified that Catherine might prioritize investigation over child safety. But Catherine, if protecting Sophie means I have to disappear, if keeping her safe requires me to take her somewhere far away and stop investigating, then we'll finish without you. The words came out harder than Catherine intended, came out almost cruel in their pragmatic clarity. But I don't think it will come to that. I think Marcus doesn't kill children. His murders are strategic targeted, designed to eliminate threats while maintaining deniability. 7-year-old girl isn't threat to him. She's liability. Killing child brings attention, brings investigation, brings emotional response from authorities who might overlook adult deaths, but react differently when innocents are targeted. You're betting my daughter's life on that theory. Daniel's voice was flat, was challenge, was demand that Catherine acknowledge stakes involved. I'm betting all our lives on building case so strong Marcus can't kill his way out of it. Catherine stood paced to windows, stared out at Manhattan, glittering like circuit board of ambition and greed. Every person down there has something they'd die for, something they'd kill for, something that matters more than survival. For me, it's finishing what my father started. For you, it's Sophie's future. For Margaret, it's honoring the 17, no 54 people she watched die while staying silent. We channel that into investigation. We let it make us careful instead of reckless. We use it to stay focused when staying focused feels impossible. She turned back to face Daniel, saw him watching her with expression she couldn't read, with something that looked like admiration or recognition, or perhaps just weary understanding of someone who'd learned same brutal lessons she was learning now. Behind him, the timeline of deaths glowed on her computer screen. 54 names that represented 54 lives cut short, 54 families destroyed, 54 futures erased, because one man had decided profit mattered more than humanity. We start with Chicago daughter tomorrow. Catherine's voice shifted into command mode, into CEO efficiency that turned emotion into action items. I'll call her in morning, express concern about irregularities in her father's accounts. Suggest meeting to discuss what I've discovered. You'll analyze his financial records, build detailed documentation of how his money was stolen, create timeline that shows theft accelerated right before his death. What about Marcus? Daniel's question was practical, was recognition that their investigation had to happen while maintaining normal appearance. He's going to expect updates from you. He's going to want to know how your new consultant is performing. He's going to watch for any indication you suspect something wrong. I'll give him updates that are true but incomplete. Catherine had already planned this, had already strategized how to maintain cover while pursuing truth. You're helping me review risk models, identify inefficiencies, improve our analytical capabilities. All true, just happens that what you're really analyzing is his criminal enterprise rather than our legitimate business operations. Her phone buzzed. Text from Marcus Blackwell. Dinner tomorrow, need to discuss Q4 strategy and concerns about your new hire. The subtext was clear. Marcus had noticed Daniel's promotion, had questions about why Catherine had elevated custodian to senior consultant, wanted to assess whether this represented threat that needed managing. Catherine showed Daniel the message, watched his face go carefully neutral, watched him process implications with speed that suggested he'd expected exactly this, had prepared for a moment when Marcus Blackwell's attention would focus on him with intention that was never benign. Go to dinner. Daniel's voice was steady, was strategic. Act normal. Express enthusiasm about my analytical skills. Show him financial work I've done. That's legitimate risk model improvements, portfolio optimizations, technical analysis that proves I'm valuable to company without revealing what I'm really investigating. And Catherine, be careful. He's killed 54 people. He won't hesitate to add you to that list if he suspects your threat. The warning hung between them, sharp with danger. Neither could ignore heavy with recognition that they were playing game where mistakes were fatal, where single misstep meant death that would look natural, where paranoia was survival skill rather than psychological disorder. I'm always careful. Catherine typed response to Marcus. Dinner sounds perfect. 8 p.m. Looking forward to discussing Daniel's excellent work. He's already identified 3 major efficiency improvements that will save us millions. The lies came easily because they were layered with truth, because the best deceptions were built on foundations of honesty that made dishonesty invisible. She hit send, then looked at Daniel, at man who'd lost everything fighting this fight, and was somehow brave enough to fight again at person who represented possibility she'd spent years avoiding. Because possibilities meant vulnerability, meant risk, meant accepting that caring about someone gave them power to hurt her. If anything happens to me, Catherine started, but Daniel interrupted. Nothing's going to happen to you. His voice was fierce, was protective, was spoken with conviction that felt almost like promise. I've already lost my wife to Marcus Blackwell. I'm not losing you too. We're going to be smart, going to be careful, going to survive this, because surviving means Sophie grows up safe, and Rachel's death means something, and your father's death means something, and all 54 murders lead to justice instead of being forgotten. He stood moved closer, close enough that Catherine could see exhaustion in his face, could see determination burning through fatigue, could see something else she didn't want to name because naming it meant acknowledging feelings that were premature at best and dangerous at worst. We should call it a night. Daniel's words were practical, but his eyes said something different, said something about connection forming between them that was more than professional alliance, more than shared investigation, more than tactical partnership. You need rest before dinner with Marcus. I need to get home before Sophie wakes up wondering where I am. And we both need distance from this. He gestured at documents covering the table. Because staring at death count makes you forget how to live, makes you numb when numbness is luxury we can't afford. Catherine walked him to elevator, stood in hallway that was empty, except for cleaning crew several floors below, stood in space that felt private despite being public, stood closer than professional distance normally permitted because professional distance felt increasingly inadequate for what they were becoming to each other. Daniel. His name came out soft, came out vulnerable, came out with uncertainty that Catherine Sterling rarely allowed herself to express. Thank you for trusting me, for fighting with me, for giving me reason to care about something beyond quarterly earnings and stock prices. Thank you for seeing me. His response was equally soft, equally vulnerable, equally honest. For 4 years, I've been invisible. Janitor people walk past without noticing. Parent people pity without helping. Survivor people forget as soon as conversation ends. You saw me. You believed me. You gave me chance to be more than ghost of person I used to be. The elevator arrived with quiet ding, that shattered moment that returned them to practical reality of late evening, an investigation, and separate lives they maintain despite growing alliance. Daniel stepped inside, turned to face her, held her gaze with intensity that made Catherine's breath catch. Be careful tomorrow night. His voice carried weight, carried concern, carried something that sounded almost like fear. Marcus Blackwell is charming when he wants to be, persuasive, charismatic. That's how he's gotten away with murder for 12 years. People trust him, believe him, accept his explanations because rejecting them means accepting that monster looks like friend, that evil wears expensive suits, that death speaks with cultured accent and sophisticated vocabulary. I know what he is. Catherine heard steel in her own voice, heard certainty that came from watching her father's recording, from understanding she'd been manipulated by murderer for 5 years. I won't forget. I won't be fooled. I won't let him see anything except loyal CEO taking guidance from trusted advisor. The elevator doors closed, taking Daniel away, leaving Catherine alone in an empty hallway that suddenly felt cold despite climate control, that felt dangerous despite security systems, that felt like space where anything could happen. Because when you discovered your world was built on murder and lies, when you learned that safety was illusion, carefully maintained through violence, when you understood that powerful psychopath had been guiding your decisions for years while planning God knows what, every space felt dangerous, every moment felt precarious, every breath felt like luxury that could be revoked without warning. Catherine returned to her office, gathered documents, locked them in safe that only she could access, erased digital traces of evening's research, maintained operational security that was becoming instinctive, was becoming essential survival skill. Her apartment waited, sterile, expensive, empty. But tonight, empty felt safe, felt like sanctuary, felt like space where Marcus Blackwell's influence couldn't reach. Even though she knew that was illusion, knew that truly powerful people had reach, that extended everywhere, knew that thinking anywhere was safe was naive comfort she couldn't afford. She poured second scotch. She rarely drank, stood at windows overlooking city that never slept and thought about 54 murders and 3 families she'd contact tomorrow. and dinner with killer who'd spent 5 years pretending to be friend. Catherine Sterling had spent 33 years learning to be strong, learning to be independent, learning to need nothing and no one because needing meant vulnerable meant weak. But strength that came from isolation wasn't actually strength. It was fear disguised as power was loneliness. Masquerading as choice was protection that prevented growth because growth required risk and risk required accepting that some things mattered more than safety. Daniel Matthews mattered. His daughter Sophie mattered. Justice for 54 murdered people mattered. Truth about her father's death mattered. These things mattered enough to risk everything, enough to fight despite fear, enough to choose courage over comfort. Tomorrow she'd have dinner with Marcus Blackwell and pretend everything was normal. Tomorrow she'd call Chicago Daughter and begin building coalition of victims' families. Tomorrow she'd continue investigating while maintaining perfect facade that nothing was wrong. Tomorrow the real war would begin. But tonight, Catherine Sterling was simply a woman who'd discovered she was capable of caring, despite years of cultivating indifference, who'd found ally in unexpected place, who'd chosen justice over safety and truth over comfortable lies. Somewhere in Queens, Daniel Matthews was checking on sleeping. Daughter was promising her silent future without violence, was believing for first time in years that promises might actually be keepable. And in Brooklyn, Margaret Chen was safeguarding evidence, was maintaining vigil she'd kept for 5 years, was hoping that finally someone brave enough and strong enough and desperate enough was going to finish what William Sterling and Rachel Matthews had died trying to accomplish. The night deepened. Manhattan glittered. Evil slept soundly, believing itself untouchable. But Catherine Sterling wasn't sleeping. She was planning. She was preparing. She was transforming from person who had been controlled into warrior who would fight back. And Marcus Blackwell, who'd murdered 54 people without consequence, was about to discover that 55th intended victim was different, was armed with truth, was supported by allies, was willing to risk everything, because having nothing left to lose was its own kind of power. The Ice Queen was melting. What emerged was fire. Catherine arrived at Le Bernardin wearing Armani that cost more than Daniel earned in a month of custodial work, wearing pearls that had belonged to her grandmother, wearing confidence that was half genuine and half performance, because performing confidence was sometimes the only way to access actual courage. Marcus Blackwell was already seated at corner table that provided privacy without isolation, that allowed conversation without being overheard, that demonstrated power through location, because certain tables in certain restaurants were available only to certain people. He stood when she approached, kissed her cheek with avuncular warmth that made Catherine's skin crawl, held her chair with gentleman's courtesy that was theater designed to disguise predator as protector. The wine he'd ordered cost $800. Catherine recognized the vintage because her father had kept similar bottles in climate-controlled cellars she'd inherited along with everything else. "You look radiant, Catherine." Marcus's voice carried patrician smoothness that came from generations of privilege from boarding schools and Ivy League and clubs that didn't advertise membership because exclusivity was the point. "This consulting hire has clearly energized you. Tell me about Daniel Matthews." The direct question was, test was probe, was Marcus establishing whether Catherine knew who Daniel was, or whether she'd hired him in ignorance, whether this represented threat or coincidence. Catherine sipped wine that tasted like liquid gold, that probably should have been savored, but that she barely noticed because every sense was focused on maintaining facade, on reading Marcus's micro-expressions, on navigating conversation that could determine whether she lived or died. Brilliant analyst. Catherine kept her voice warm, kept her expression enthusiastic, kept her body language open, because closed body language would signal discomfort. Found an $18 million error in our European projections within minutes of seeing them. Wharton MBA previous experience at Quantum Investments. Took career break for personal reasons, but clearly retained his analytical capabilities. Quantum Investments. Marcus repeated the name without inflection, without emphasis, as though it meant nothing, as though he hadn't been on their advisory board, as though he hadn't signed documents establishing fraud infrastructure, as though company name didn't represent 12 years of systematic theft and murder. I seem to recall they had problems few years back. Some disgruntled employee making accusations. Catherine felt ice in her veins, felt perfect clarity that came from understanding this was critical moment. This was test that would determine Marcus's next actions. This was opportunity to either escalate suspicion or deflect it. She laughed, light dismissive, the particular laugh that powerful people used when discussing powerless people who'd failed to understand how power worked. Daniel mentioned that, said he reported some accounting irregularities and got caught in political crossfire when investigation revealed the problems were more extensive than anyone realized. She met Marcus's eyes, directly held his gaze without flinching.